I'm going to continue showing you some different techniques for sculpting as we improve upon this terrain. One thing I do want to show you is when we did shift around the geometry to pull it up towards the overhang to give us a little more polygons to work with. It is stretching and modifying the overall structure of the grid. And what we'll be able to see is kind of a curvature in the wireframe. And we may need to kind of push these other polygons over, or push down this area in order to keep it consistent. Also making sure we don't go below that bottom layer. And as you can see, this will clip out the terrain. And if you're exporting the terrain as 3D geometry, this will not be part of it, which can throw off your entire model. So we could also go around and just kind of lift up these areas. But I do want to mention that the 3D and displacement geometry run separately from, of course, the original pixel geometry that we use to generate the original terrain. And the sculpting is really useful for a lot of different parts of terrain creation. Typically, you would use it to modify your existing terrains as sort of a last step in the process to use the elevation that is currently there and kind of expand upon it without going to extremes, although you certainly can. There are limitations when you're doing that. Let's take a look at running some of these filters over, or some of the presets on the left. What I'm going to do is just click on the mountain. And because we pulled all of these polygons over, you're going to see stretching of the roughness around those areas. Because this process in effect is no longer equal by doing so. Which is why I say typically with sculpting it would be something to somewhat exaggerate the current geometry without going to an extreme. But that really depends on the tools you're going to be using, and you don't necessarily have to run these filters. Of course, without them, in this case, we don't really have a lot of detail. And in a later lesson, I'll show exactly the full breakdown of each individual layer of geometry, also how to reset the individual layers. But I will say, because they are independent, we can do more drastic things to the terrain, changing what would be the elevation. And then you can see how that reacts with the sculpted geometry, because this was sculpted for that previous elevation. And now that I've run the canyon over the top of it, we are not seeing the geometry as it was before, but it still creates something fairly interesting. It's just not necessarily a precise flow of geometry. So undo. And I do want to show you how we can look at just the 3D sculpted geometry, just the displacement layer, which is actually fairly easy. We can go to Filter Altitude, up at the top, edit this filter, and just take this right point and drag it all the way down. Click OK, and click Preview. And now we can see just that sculpted layer. This is purely the displacement geometry. There is no other elevation part of this. I'm just going to hit the X so I don't apply that. But I did notice a little artifact that might cause a problem later. We'll go back and run that again just to be sure. And it looks like it was more of an OpenGL error. So if you wanted to clean up the displacement layer only so that it doesn't have as drastic of an impact or cause any issues, because sometimes you'll see overlapping geometry within the displacement layer but not in the full geometry. You can export out the terrain, and I cover this more in the next lessons where I show the breakdown of each layers, and that way you can preserve the elevation and that pixel layer, clear out everything except the displacement, and then import that back in as a picture. So you can pretty easily just work on individual layers. Cover that more in another section. I do want to show some of my filtering techniques. So one thing I want to do is pull out some of this geometry around this ridge and this overhang, but I don't want to trigger that division of the geometry where we increase the resolution. Because right now I'm at a fairly good level. It's nice and equal, and I really don't want to do any fine detailing just yet. But there are still ways to pull out some of these areas. What I've done is designed, or just made a filter that is a detail filter, and I've just got two main detail filters. I'm going to go ahead and load in detail 2. And if we edit the filter, we can just see it's just 2 points, or actually 3 because there's one on the end. But I'm cutting off the flow and bringing it below the 0.5. This will result in kind of a smaller brush. It may take an increased flow. And granted, it will modify the geometry scale based on the brush size, but it does allow you to create kind of a smaller brush. And that way you can fix up and paint on some of the smaller areas without dividing the geometry. So that's pretty nice. We'll need to smooth out the area if there are too many problems and if it gets too erratic. I'm going to go ahead and edit this filter and just pull up this left point to 1, and I am going to take this over to 0.5 and just bring it slightly over. Hopefully that will prevent the geometry from doing what it just did, where it got really jagged. Because if you're editing just that outer or lower geometry layer and not modifying something smaller, it could cause a few issues. So we can see what's happening now, where it is a little jagged, and that's because the brush is probably just too small. Increase the brush size, and now we can pull out those areas, reduce the flow. Just kind of a neat way to not have to worry about increasing the geometry level to modify some of these other areas. So in fact, it's kind of like having a smaller brush, but as you can see, it is kind of skipping some of those points. So if that's becoming a problem, you can smooth that out, switch between a different brush. And then it should be okay. So you may not want to fall too far. We could just reduce it a little. And then sculpt, pulling that out. And now I'm not really seeing those jagged points. And as we run along, you might have to make one or two passes in order to take care of that extra geometry or skipping the points. But normally you can just increase the size, switch to the smooth out that area, still have some of those finer details. So that's a pretty cool way to add a little variation on the sculpt without horribly destroying a terrain. Since unfortunately we cannot go into the geometry itself and reduce the overall amount. So the inflate brush also becomes very useful around these areas. When you inflate around an edge, you can create some pretty nice detail. And then if you use the invert around the bottom, you can create a really nice outline, making sure that you don't overlap the geometry as we did just now. So what I can do is reverse and inflate to bring it back and then smooth. Sometimes it's easier just to do the opposite of what you did to get it back before smoothing, because sometimes a smooth won't get rid of that split geometry. And once again, paying attention to the polygon count before we increase the resolution. Also, on the top, if we increase our size, go to that noise filter, inflate, invert, we can pull in some of these sections and kind of subtract on the top a little, and also using the same filter to smooth, and that makes it a little more interesting on top. And then use freeform, we can push it around. And I'm going to load in another filter, which is an Iffy filter. If you take a look, I'm using curves. One thing you'll tell and be able to see from the presets that come with Vue for the brush directory, none of them use curves. And the reason for this is curves will often go outside the bounds of the filter, and unless it's designed correctly and you really pay attention, it could cause some issues and some overlaps. So this is my brush that you might want to get a little more familiar with sculpting before you use it, but can in fact be very helpful. Start with a low flow if you're going to be using it, and it will create some very nice geometry around overhangs. If you invert, go along the bottom, you can pull in some of this geometry in a different way than you normally would be able to without the curve. But, as I was saying, it does sometimes cause issues, and you can see right there by trying to reverse to fix that overlap, it didn't work. And the curves will cause that problem. So if you need to switch to a linear brush, and now we can see even there, it didn't exactly correct the issue. So we'll take a look, and now even though the preview looks okay, there might actually be a problem with the geometry underneath it. And always remembering too that the changes you make to the sculpt really go hand in hand with that underlying geometry that unfortunately we can't really see. So always keeping in mind that that other geometry is there. Sometimes the errors you see are not from the sculpt or the displacement layer, but they are in fact from the pixels that are being controlled by the displacement. So I'm just rendering a preview render of this edge, and that jaggedness that wasn't really showing in the editor is showing in the way the shadows are calculated, because I was using a reduced brush. So it is important to switch back between the terrain editor and the scene itself. Even just doing a preview render can give you an idea of if there's any problems. Even the shadow map in the OpenGL is sometimes a good indication. Now, I've always intended to increase the geometry level of this terrain, so I'm not worried about those. I know they'll go away. But if you are going to be limiting your geometry to the current level that we have right now, then you would need to in fact smooth out some of those areas and maybe use some of this other geometry to pull it out. And that's where getting that extra geometry becomes more helpful. Another trick to help you work on areas of a terrain is if you scale the Z on the Z higher than what you intend to have. Sometimes you can see directly within the main interface some of the issues by the different levels of geometry, and also gives you a slightly larger work area when you're in the terrain editor. So right now we see all these jagged edges that we saw from using that limited brush or the reduced filter, and we'll be able to clean it up a little bit easier once it's stretched out, and then we can just return the scale back to where it was before. So sometimes you can use this stretching technique to give yourself a little more room to work on an area. It is, of course, stretching out polygons, but sometimes too it's a good way to pull out and see seams that you may not have found before. So that could be a pretty nice way to get rid of that. And what I'm going to do is load in the Gaussian and edit the filter and just take that first point and pull it down just a little. You can really see that their presets are using a lot of points to define that curve rather than using an actual curve. I really don't see any problems from the brush I had used with the curve, and I do have other ones that are a little more extreme. So if you're going to be going through the provided collection, you might want to take a look at them first and make sure that they're not curved if you don't feel comfortable using them. So now what I'm doing is fixing the larger, lower res layer using a bigger brush to kind of even out those polygons. And then we can step it down. And what I'm going to do is switch to the freeform, invert, and just kind of move along here. And if I notice it getting too jagged, where I think maybe it's going to be an issue, I can smooth out those different levels. But you can still create some pretty neat effects doing that, and even leaving those points sometimes can be useful. So now that this is stretched out, I've also got a little more control over using the clip technique and being able to constrain the clipping range so that I can see a little bit better what it is I'm working on. So what I'm going to do is reduce most of the inside geometry, and if I need to, I can stretch the terrain out a little bit more. But what I'm going to do is use the inflate, invert, scale it up a bit to affect a larger area. And now the closer we have some of these lines that are coming down in any of the creases, they are more likely to overlap and split when using the inverted inflate. So if needed, you can use a freeform and push them in rather than using the inflate. Because when you invert it, it really does sometimes cause problems. It's actually sometimes more effective to go from the bottom of the terrain and looking through this area and inflating with the invert and pulling that in. You can also see the creases and get to them a little bit better if you're having any issues. I see a very obvious crease here. So what I might need to do to get rid of that is first inflate it and then smooth it out, and then adjust the level of detail, the size of the brush, to be able to get to that lower geometry level and fix anything else that might cause a problem. Now I did just divide the geometry, so I'm going to go ahead and undo because I don't need to add the extra just yet. Return that to its spot, and I may or may not have had the clipping range turned on. So you do need to make sure you check that in order to only affect a certain area. But I do want to pull in a little bit more around the edge before I decide to increase the geometry. I'm also going to smooth that out. Any areas that might be a problem, try to avoid the edge, if at all possible, with the sculpted areas, because once we return the value, it might cause problems with the blend, and we may not even see it in the editor, but it might show up in the render, or even just in the OpenGL. In the main preview, it looks like everything's okay, but sometimes a few lines can show up, so it's just something to pay attention to. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this back down. and that was much easier to work with to reduce the inside and give us just a little bit more surface area to really see what was going on. So let's take a look at using textures to control the brush. Textures, there are a few important things to note when using them. So we'll take a look at those as we move along. I'm just going to inflate that edge a little and do a little fine tuning. But what you can do if you want to use a texture for a brush or an alpha, on the bottom you can click to use an image, and it's going to take the last brush you had loaded in and show that. If you right click, you can then load in your brush. And I do want to note that these brushes need to be inverted from normal and most other application brushes. If you're a ZBrush user, it would be an inverted version of an alpha you would use to define a ZBrush, or a brush in ZBrush, and also Photoshop and several other applications. Unfortunately, there is no built-in invert for this texture, so you do need to manually do that. What I've done is take the 1500 alpha brush collection from XyleFX and took the JPEG versions and inverted them, and then kept the PSD files the same, because those PSD files will not work within the terrain editor, so you do have to use the JPEGs, but it's usually more than enough to be able to get the detail you need. So I'm just going to select a brush and load it in, and if you take a look, there's a slider right next to where we load in the brush, and what this controls is the subdivision of the displacement layer. You will only see that if you are working with displaced terrain, and you can subdivide up to a certain polygon amount. And you can also choose to reduce it all the way so you're not subdividing anything and only just painting normal with it and manipulating the size of the current brush. So if we choose to subdivide, it's going to increase the geometry level, and we just bumped up to 1,000,000 polys, and it just doesn't look good. You want to be careful when using the subdivision that you either keep at a very low amount if you're going to be going equally throughout the terrain. Typically, I just like to keep it off. I'd rather have it as a modifier to work with a filter to modify the geometry rather than dividing the mesh because of some of the current problems. Now, this will change direction based on the camera angle and also the normal. There is no way to rotate the brush directly, but as you can see, as we move around the terrain, the brush does turn with it. So if we have it on subdivide, with a larger brush, it's not going to subdivide because it needs to be at that certain level in order to trigger that. If we have it set to a really high amount, it will in fact divide the geometry as we just saw. But I like to have a little more control over that rather than dividing it with a brush, I'd rather do it with the no effect filter and then start brushing into it. So until some improvements are made with the way that geometry works, it's best just to keep it so the subdivision is off. If you use the 2D tools, we can see the brush, and this way we can modify that pixel layer. You can also paint your material distributions. You can also see this is probably one of the better ways to get the detail out of a standard terrain when it's sculpted. Because when you have a large amount of manipulation, it can be difficult to run those filters as I was showing before. We can change the size. Smooth that out. And when you're working with these 2D brushes, there's another tool that's available that can be really useful. I'm just going to raise the terrain. And now if we select the undo brush, we can paint over to undo what we just did. And then if we go back over it again, it'll continue to paint. So this is a really neat way to apply a large effect and then go back over it, reducing it to where it was before. And every time you click, it'll redo the process up to a certain point. You will eventually reach a point where that large original modification you make may not be available, but as long as you continue the stroke and then go to undo, you can go through there, change it, or bring it back if you modified it again, and it becomes a really nice way to kind of manipulate certain areas. We can also see that by using the 2D brushes, we can pull out some of these zones separate from that sculpt, because of course they are different sets of geometry, and it's always important to keep that in mind. Because you don't want to work exclusively with the sculpting layer, even though it is sort of a finishing product in some cases. To start out with terrains, I would suggest really using it to make modifications to a somewhat finalized terrain, to add overhangs, things like that, not creating a vast amount of change. And then as you get used to working with the tools and really becoming familiar with them and understanding why certain tools work the way they do, then you can move on to more complex terrains. So we can use the raise brush, so manipulating the 2D geometry rather than the 3D geometry, and sometimes create something better than what's going to happen if we sculpt it. So always important to jump back and forth, and if something happens, you're not really getting the result you want with a 3D brush, just try switching over and see what is you can do with it. And going back to the texture brushes, what I'm going to do is load in a square texture, something that will have some obvious edges. Now, depending on the filter you're using, those square edges might show up. And the higher the resolution is on the terrain, the more likely you're going to see those square shapes. And those outer edges showing. So one thing you can do is I've created a filter that you can load in, and it's called Texture Round. It rounds the edges of textures. So anytime you have that steep end, or you're cutting it off early, in this case what we can see is we now have a round brush with a nice fall off before it reaches the texture. This way you don't create that square edge and it won't show up. Depending on the harshness of the texture. If you're still seeing the square edge, what you can do is edit the filter and just kind of bring in and limit the overall output. Now this has a lot of points in it, so it might be difficult to keep the curve, but it will in fact round off the brush, which is pretty nice. That way you can use square textures and not be limited to rounder textures. Because textures are in fact a very useful way to add detail to the overall terrain. And you can of course paint with them as well, adjusting the material distributions when a material is selected and 2D brushing is selected as well. So we definitely need more detail now. We need to increase the resolution of the terrain in order to be able to pull out more details, define certain areas, etc. So what I want to do is first turn off this texture, and I'm also going to smooth some of these jagged areas really quick. Click OK, save it out because we've reached another step. And the file sizes for this really are rather small, so saving steps along the way and incremental saves doesn't take up a lot of hard drive space, so it's not really a big deal. But what we can see is using that last texture created a slight pixelation, which we'll be able to take care of. So I'm going to go in to edit the object, and up at the top I'm going to double the terrain resolution. Now this has increased the polygon count of the pixel layer, which means the 3D layer and the pixel layer are now no longer equal, or the displacement layer is smaller than the pixel layer, which means we might be able to see those seams showing up through the different zones of the terrain. It might also cause some errors until we increase and divide the terrain further. I am going to select the terrain and just scale it down. We can also see that we are going to need to clean up some of those areas underneath the overhang, mainly because polygons are just being stretched. I can in fact see the seam. Move the camera in, and you can see a nice little separation right there. So once again, material should take care of this. And in a preview render, it's hardly noticeable. Even stepping up to a better anti-aliasing and a better render, it would still be difficult to see, which is quite good. It's on a smoother surface that you would really start to see that. If you are having problems with the division seam, where the sculpted displacement geometry and the pixel layer are separate resolutions, or the sculpted geometry layer is under or has a lower polygon count than the pixel layer, one thing you can do to completely remove that seam that is showing up is to bake the terrain. Now, when you bake a terrain and bake the object, it becomes a mesh, which is no longer editable. So you will not be able to edit it further. One thing to keep in mind, that would be the absolute final step that you would make. So your terrain would be finished, finalized, ready to go before you go ahead and do that. So basically build it up, and if you run into that problem, you can bake it. And standard terrains will bake the displacement layer with them, so there's not any problems there. I will show really quick, there is one more step than just the bake. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste. Just move this up. I'm going to bake it to polygons. I'm just going to choose something slightly under halfway. Usually that slider gives you about 2 different levels of resolution. So if you go beyond 50%, it's normally all the same resolution. Below 50%, it's usually the same. In this case, it looks like I baked it at the highest resolution. So that seam is still going to be there. I can see it. It might be difficult to see in the screen grab. I'll go ahead and zoom in. And because I'm recording, my system response time is getting horrible. But we can still see the seam. So what we need to do is edit the object and modify the mesh smoothing angle. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 89 and click OK. So it's going to re-smooth the mesh, and then that seam that is showing up will be removed. So now it is completely gone. So it was really just needed a refresh of the smoothing. So if you are running into that problem where it's showing up and the material isn't covering it, if you know you don't need to edit that terrain further, you can bake the mesh. Now that's not going to work if you need the detail of a procedural terrain. And I'm also going to warn you that the UV map that is generated for the baked terrains are terrible. At the moment, if it's sculpted and you have any sort of terrain you would possibly want to create, the UV map that's generated for it is just kind of useless. In some cases, it can be a good starting point. You might need to relax the geometry. Of course, that would be in another application. You wouldn't do that in Vue. But otherwise, the UV map's flat, projected from the top. And in some cases, you might be able to get away with that if you adjust a material with slope. But it will be difficult to get detail around areas underneath, like ridges, just like we have on the side of the terrain. So that's really going to depend on the output. And if you did want to take the terrain and export it, bring it into ZBrush, you would need to have ZBrush generate a new UV map for it, because otherwise you're going to run into a lot of problems. I also want to note that the direct export and import into ZBrush is not going to work because the points aren't welded. So you do need an in-between application to weld those points together or merge them together. And then you can export it from the other application. And you normally want to get it out of the triangles too, so you would untriangulate the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that baked mesh. We can go back to this terrain, and now we want to increase not only, of course, that pixel layer, but also go in and we can increase the displacement layer as well. So before I divide the geometry for the displacement layer further, I do want to use our new mesh resolution for the pixel layer to run one of the effects over it, maybe get a little more detail, or paint on it with textures. Some of these effects will only work within a certain altitude. So if you need to, and let's go ahead and take a look at mountain and see if it causes any problems. Actually, it looks okay. I'm going to undo that. I just want to show you what can happen. So I'm going to go ahead and run the peak filter. Even that seems to be working out all right. Sometimes the geometry gets displaced and modified so much that you really do need to equalize it. So we can see that most of these effects are actually working pretty well. If you do find you need to equalize, you can go up to the top, click the equalize, and it will adjust the height, and that can sometimes be helpful. It can sometimes be really important that you equalize the terrain too after you double the resolution of the pixel layer, just to make sure that everything's lining up correctly and that you don't really have any scale issues. So sometimes that could be an important thing to pay attention to. So now I want to increase the overall resolution of the displacement layer. So I am going to load in my no effect filter, reduce the size of the brush, and switch to the wireframe mode, and we can start to subdivide. Just turn off airbrush. And we do want to make sure that we're only doubling the resolution. If you have way too small of a brush, what can happen is it will more than double it and cause some sampling problem. It may also be way more geometry than you need. You can also take a look and see that we're no longer working with 4 large zones or quadrants. It is broken down even further. So every time we move to the next step, we do need to subdivide each area. And you also want to just make sure that everything is consistent throughout. And if we go ahead and take a look, we can also check to see how the seams are showing, or if they're showing, and if there's any separation between the geometry, which can start to show up once we start dividing these individual areas. So I do want to see where the camera is at. Just to make sure we're in the right area and not paying attention to the wrong place. And then we can check and see if there's any tears, and there is definitely a tear, and that's going to cause problems. So we need to do this equally throughout the terrain. Once we reach a certain level and resolution, that no longer becomes as big of an issue. Once you're up the 1 million, 2 million polygon range for your displacement layer, it's certainly much easier to avoid this kind of issue. So then the superfine detailing that will bring you up to 3 million polygons or more typically won't cause this kind of an issue or a noticeable one. If you just can't afford to have that much geometry in the scene, if you've got a lot of other objects, one thing you can do to kind of cover up the seam, besides putting the object underneath, as I had showed earlier, is you may be able to kind of pinch it together, because simply just smoothing it isn't going to work, because those points just aren't connected. So other than just dividing the mesh, if you need to, you may be able to inflate. Usually it reverse. And sometimes what I like to do is go underneath the terrain for that. So we'll line up that little ball and zoom in to the seam underneath the terrain. And sometimes we can just move that along. I'm going to have to increase the size and kind of adjust the brush. That flow is definitely a little too high. So this would take a little bit of a smaller brush, but hopefully not too small where it would divide the geometry. So go ahead and click OK. Sometimes that can help fix that kind of an issue, but typically it doesn't. It's just an attempt to kind of bring the points closer together. And it may help fix some of your issues, and it may not. And the biggest problem with these tears is really when you're trying to get the shadows to work correctly. So it's usually more of a problem with subtracting a shadow. If you're close up, then you'll be able to see through it, or you might get some lighting problems, especially if you're using radiosity or anything that has to calculate a pre-pass, because you're going to get light leaks and things like that. If you're planning on really just taking care of everything in post, or you're working on digital mats, then for the most part those seams, the separations, probably won't have that big of an impact, because you can just fix it in post much quicker than you'd be able to fix it within Vue, and without using as many system resources. But if you do run into any larger issues, you may need to divide the geometry further in order to get it to work correctly. But these issues are really a huge issue, or a big problem with procedural terrains. So since we're working with a standard terrain, we can get away with a lot more. There is one other thing I do want to mention that has to do with the scale. And this is, I'm assuming, a bug. Whether or not it gets fixed in the future, I don't know. I've done a lot of testing on it, and I can definitely tell that the system has issues for doing some things. What I'm going to do is add in a standard terrain, edit the object, and if I bring this up to 2048 by 2048 resolution, and now if I choose to sculpt and paint the displacement layer, once you click OK to close the terrain editor, it causes a huge memory leak. If you're using Windows, I haven't tested this on Mac, but it is currently an issue within Windows, and it won't even show up in the task manager as Vue using that much memory. But all of your system memory will be gone, and your system will freeze. Your mouse won't even move. So avoid that if you can. You can do it with the procedural terrain. That doesn't seem to have any problems, but as a standard terrain, it does hang up the system. I let it sit for about 8 hours after doing that to see if it would respond, and it didn't. So avoid that if you can.